Okay, so welcome to lecture 2 of my classical Greek introductory course. Today, we are going to start looking at the declensions of nouns. Especially, we are going to concentrate today on masculine nouns of the second declension. These nouns are of the kind which in the nominative case end in os in the singular. A classic example of this kind of noun is the word logos. This is a word with notoriously many meanings, but it can mean word. Furthermore, we are going to look at another type of nouns in the second declension. These are the second declension nouns, which in the nominative case end in on. In Greek, nouns in the second declension with an on ending in the nominative singular are actually always of the neuter gender. An example of a second declension noun of this type is the word ergon, which means work or deed. Moreover, we are today also going to acquaint ourselves with the definite article, which is the Greek equivalent to the English de, or the German der, die, das. In all actuality, the Greek definite articles behave very much like the German ones as well. Finally, we are also going to make our first cut into the Greek verbal system. Specifically, we are going to look at the present indicative active forms of verbs. So, but let's begin with the second declension nouns. These you find on page 43 to 45 in the Cambridge Grammar of Classical Greek, which we use on this course. In Classical Greek, there are 3 declensions, which show, on the one hand, nouns, but also how adjectives and pronouns are inflected. That is the way their endings change in different numbers and cases. The different declensions of nouns, adjectives, and pronouns will be dealt with later on during the course. At this juncture, it may be noted, for the sake of comparison, that most modern European languages have clearly distinguishable declensions for nouns too. For instance, in modern Swedish, there are 5 of them. And the exception in this regard is actually represented by modern English, where declensions are difficult to discern, since the plural forms of almost all nouns and pronouns are marked with the affix s. That is, an s is added to the end of the word to mark it as a plural form. To return to the Greek second declension, we can look first at the masculine nouns ending in os. Nouns of this type have a specific inflection, which is marked by the endings always being the same, no matter which noun of this specific type we are looking at. So, for instance, the singular nominative ending of any masculine word in the second declension will always be os, whether the inflected word is logos, or, for instance, the other example you can see here on the PowerPoint, topos, which means place. We will return to the inflection of these kinds of nouns in a moment. But first, a few more general points about Greek nouns. All Greek nouns and pronouns are of a certain gender. There are three of these genera: the masculine, the feminine, and the neuter gender. It's important to know what gender a word has, because in a sentence they are usually connected to other words. For instance, nouns may be connected to adjectives as well as to definite articles, and all of these connected words then need to be of the same gender. Otherwise, the sentence will become very weird indeed. The best place to find out what gender a noun or adjective has is a dictionary. Another thing we have to keep focus on whenever we deal with nouns, adjectives, or pronouns, and in this regard also verbs, is the number of the verb in question. In classical Greek, there are three of these numeri. They are the singular, the plural, and the dual, expressing one, many, and two. Of modern European languages, at least Irish retains the dual, but actually dual forms were quite uncommon already in classical Greek. And therefore, we will not deal with them to any greater extent during this course. In other words, the numbers we will concentrate on during this lecture and in the following ones are the singular and the plural. Apart from number and gender, any given noun is also inflected in accordance with different cases. In modern English, nouns are inflected in 3 cases. In Swedish, only in 2, whereas in Finnish, nouns can take 15 different cases. Classical Greek has 5 different cases for nouns, pronouns, and adjectives. These are the nominative, the genitive, the accusative, the dative, and the vocative. Of these, the nominative is often referred to as the normal or the straight case. It is also usually the case in which the subject of any given sentence is given. When inflected in any of these cases, the noun changes its ending in each case, and it is therefore always possible to derive from the ending of a noun, pronoun, or adjective which case it has. So, to summarize what has been said so far, what you need to know about a classical Greek noun, pronoun, or adjective in order to begin to analyze it and determine its place in a sentence is its gender, its number, and its case. Moreover, you need to know how the noun is inflected in different cases. And it's these later rules that we will delve deeper into now. So if we look again at our paradigmatical second declension masculine word, logos, we may note first that it has a stem which consists of log. The ending, on the other hand, which allows us to determine that indeed it is a second declension masculine word in the nominative singular, is in this case os. When we add this ending os to the stem log, we get exactly the nominative case of the word logos. So if someone were to ask you to describe the word logos grammatically, it will suffice for you to say that its gender is masculine, its case nominative, and its number singular. Now, when we have the stem log of the word logos, we can also easily construct other cases of the word. You see a full list of all the cases for the word logos in the singular and the plural on this PowerPoint. You can also see that I have placed a hyphen in the middle of the word to show which part is stem and which part is ending. The declension in the singular is as follows: logos in the nominative, logo in the genitive, logo in the dative, with a notable iota subscript under the final vowel, logon in the accusative, and loge in the vocative. In the plural, the declension is as follows: logoi in the nominative, logon in the genitive, logois in the dative, logos in the accusative, and logoi in the vocative. By the way, in case you wonder, the last of the Greek cases, that is the vocative, is exclusively used when a person or a thing is called on or spoken at. Its use is thus quite restricted. All the same, I would highly recommend that you learn the inflection of the word logos by heart, including the vocative, singular, and plural forms. And what is most important to note is that the case endings are always the same for any given masculine word in the second declension. Thus, we can take as an example another masculine word ending in os, and we may note that it is inflected in the same way as logos in all cases and numbers. Here, for example, we have the inflection of the word agros, which means field. In the singular, this word is inflected as agros in the nominative, agro in the genitive, agro in the dative, agron in the accusative, and agre in the vocative. And in the plural, we have agroi in the nominative, agron in the genitive, agrois in the dative, agros in the accusative, and agroi in the vocative. The only notable difference in the inflection of the words agros and logos is that the accent lies on another syllable. That is, on the first syllable in logos and on the second syllable in agros. Otherwise, the inflection is the same. Of course, the stem of the words are different as well, log and agr, but since they are both inflected according to the second declension, the endings are the same. Now, so far I have been speaking exclusively of masculine nouns in the second declension. This is because most second declension nouns are masculine. There are, however, also feminine nouns that are inflected according to the second declension in the same way as the masculine ones. You find some examples of this on page 44, section 422 in the Cambridge Grammar. For instance, we have parthenos, which is a feminine noun meaning maiden, and which is inflected according to the second declension, and which has the very same endings for all cases and numbers as the masculine nouns following the second declension. However, we will now turn to another type of nouns in the second declension, which are inflected somewhat differently. These are nouns ending in on in the nominative singular. Nouns following the second declension and ending in on in the nominative singular are always neuter. You find a paradigm for the inflection of nouns of this kind on page 45, section 424 in the Cambridge Grammar. In front of you on the PowerPoint, you now have the parodying for the word ergon, work or deed. The stem here is erg, and the word is inflected in the following way: ergon, ergo, ergo, ergon, ergon, erga, ergon, ergois, erga, erga. And of course, it's good to learn this parodying by heart as well. Although you should prioritize learning the inflection of logos if you are in lack of time. You may note here that the neuter second declension words follow a different pattern from their masculine and feminine counterparts with regard to the nominative, the accusative, and the vocative cases, while the rest of the cases are inflected in a similar way to the masculine and feminine second declension nouns. What's also worthy of notice is that the nominative and the accusative forms of the second declension words in neuter are in fact identical in the nominative, the accusative, and the vocative case, in both the singular and the plural, as well as, by the way, in the dual, although the dual forms are left out on this whole course, as I said before. This same rule regarding the identity of the nominative, the accusative, and the vocative case, in fact, applies to all words in neuter, in classical Greek, and not only in Greek, but also in Latin, as well as in Indo-European languages more generally. Okay. But the time has now come to turn to the definite article. In English, we have, of course, the definite article de that can stand before a noun in any number and case. Also in English, when we just say car or a car, we can mean any given car. But if we speak of the car, we assume that the car in question is somehow familiar to the one we speak to. And this same function for the definite article of expressing something familiar is in use also in Greek. However, here the form of the article varies according to case, number, and gender, and also in accordance with the word the article connects to. So thus we have, for instance, as you can see here on the PowerPoint, logos, that means the word, but hoi logoi, that means the words. That is, we have a masculine singular nominative article connecting to a masculine singular nominative noun, and a masculine plural nominative article that connects to a masculine plural nominative noun. And likewise, we have he parthenos, which means the maiden, but hai parthenoi, that means the maidens. So in this case, we have a feminine singular nominative article that connects to a feminine singular nominative noun, and a feminine plural nominative article that connects to a feminine plural nominative noun. Okay, so we will now overview the parodying for the inflection of the definite article as it is presented in the Cambridge Grammar. This means that we will again leave out the rare dual number, although definite articles in the dual are encountered in classical Greek texts as well. Anyhow, on the screen, you can now overview how the definite article is inflected. What you may note here is that there is a spiritus asper on the definite article when the article consists of a single vowel or a diphthong, and that many of the articles lack an accent. What this means when they lack an article is that they are so-called proclitic words, which means that their pronunciation depends on the word they stand in front of. But this is something we will return to later on in the course. But I would strongly recommend that you learn the paradigm for the inflection of the definite article by heart as well. Anyway, what we are able to do now is to combine two different nouns with definite articles to form a simple phrase. For instance, we can say ho logos tes parthenu, or as these kinds of phrases are more commonly expressed in Greek, ho tes parthenu logos, the word of the maiden. The genitive tes parthenu is in this case a so-called possessive genitive. That is, it expresses ownership, the ownership of the maiden over the word. The possessive or attributive genitive forms universally the most common use of the genitive. In classical Greek, however, there are other genitive uses as well. For instance, we have the so-called objective genitive, which in Greek is exemplified in the phrase phobos ton polemion, fear for the enemies. Here, the genitive stands in the plural, ton polemion, and expresses the object of rather than an attribute belonging to fear. What we will do next is to leave the nouns and articles for a while and turn to the basics of the verb system. Verbs are of course needed in order to form a full sentence. To speak in terms of general syntax, the verbs take the place of predicatives in clauses and sentences, whereas nouns typically represent either subjects or object. The Greek verbs are inflected on the one hand according to tense, that is the present, the imperfect, the future, and so on. On the other hand, they are also inflected in accordance with person and number. Moreover, there are different voices, for instance, the active and the passive voice, as well as moods, like the indicative and subjunctive. As for now, however, we will only learn the present indicative active forms of verbs. You find an overview of the whole so-called thematic present system of Greek verbs on page 129 in the Cambridge Grammar. Today, however, we are merely going to look at the 6 first words highest up in the left-hand corner of this chart. First, however, a few more general words of the present tense, the indicative mood and the active voice. The present tense is used for expressing what takes place at the very moment of speaking. That is, it expresses an ongoing action. The indicative mood, on the other hand, is primarily used to express factual happenings, while the active voice signifies that the action is performed by a subject. An example of a present indicative verb in English would be in the active, in the first person singular, I run, you run in the second person singular, he, she runs in the third person singular, we run in the first person plural, you run in the second person plural, and they run in the third person plural. In classical Greek, the persons and numbers are the same, but unlike in English, the verbs are also inflected differently for each different person and number. In other words, the verbs receive different endings depending on person. The usual paradigmatic example verb, which we will also look at, is paideuo, meaning I educate. Here, the root is formed by paideu, and the ending is o. And this o ending marks the verb as a first person singular. On the PowerPoint, you can now see the parodying for the present indicative active forms of paideuo in all persons in the singular and plural. You may note that I have placed an hyphen between the verb stem and the person ending, as well as another one between the ending and the vowel, falling between the stem and the ending. That is, if there is such a vowel. This vowel, as you can see, is either an epsilon or an omicron. It's called a thematic vowel, and its presence in the different verb forms shows that the verb in question is thematic. There are also so-called athematic verbs, but these we will acquaint ourselves with first by the end of the course. So this is how the verb is inflected in the present active indicative. Paideuo in the first person singular, meaning I educate. Paideues in the second person singular, you educate. Paideue in the third person singular, he or she educates. Paideuomen in the first person plural, we educate. Paideuete in the second person plural, they educate. And paideuusin in the third person plural, they educate. What you may note here is that they have placed, or that I have placed the letter ny in the end of the third person plural forms of the verb within clauses. This is to show that the verb is sometimes written with a ny and sometimes without it. Usually the ny is there when the following word in the sentence begins with a vowel, and left out when the next word begins with a consonant. The technical term for this ny is ny efelkystikon, but this is not a detail that you need to remember. It should be kept in mind, however, that Greek verbs may function as a subject as well as a predicate. That is, we don't necessarily need a pronoun or a noun in the nominative case, as would be the case in English and in Swedish, to show who or what does the action. The same rule applies, of course, also in Latin, as well as in some other modern European languages, such as in Italian. All right, today's lecture has been rather lengthy. Some of the future ones will be shorter once the groundwork has been laid. However, there is still some topics that need to be dealt with during this lecture, and these fall under the heading of general rules for syntax. that is, rules for the formation of clauses and sentences. More specifically, we need to be reminded of how to identify basic syntactic elements in clauses. Look at the sentence, "The maiden has a bird." In Greek, this sentence translates as "He parthenos ehe logon." When identifying the syntactical elements in this clause, we can begin by trying to find the predicate. The predicate is the guiding verb of the sentence, and it answers the question, what happens in the sentence? In this case, where there is only one verb, the predicate is represented by the verb standing in the third person singular. That is by has in the English version of the sentence. In the Greek version, this has translates into the present indicative active verb form ehe. In fact, the predicate in any given sentence in any given language is always a verb, and in Greek, almost always a so-called finite verb. That is a verb with a person ending. To find the subject of the verb, we have to ask the question, who performs the action described in the sentence? In this case, it is the maiden who performs the action, and therefore she is the subject. The typical case a subject takes in classical Greek is the nominative, as I said, and so it is in our example as well. He parthenos is a noun in the nominative singular, as we have learned. Usually, a sentence or a clause also contains a so-called direct object. To find out which word forms the direct object, we can pose the question what it is that is affected by the action that takes place. Here it is the word bird, which is the object of the having performed by the maiden. Therefore, it is the word which is the object in the sentence. In classical Greek, the direct object of the sentence is, in the normal case, expressed with the accusative. In our example, we have an accusative object in the word logon, which is an accusative in the singular of the noun logos, as we have learned too. Now, as we have reached this far, we can also consider a somewhat more complicated sentence. This would be a sentence which in English goes as follows. The maiden has a word for the work. In Greek, this sentence translates into he parthenos ehe logon to ergo. In this sentence, we have, apart from the subject, the predicate, and the direct object, which we have already identified, also a syntactical element in the form of a so-called indirect object. To identify the indirect object of a sentence, we can pose the question for what the action in the sentence is performed. In the English version of our sentence, the indirect object is represented by the word work. It is for the work that the maiden has the word. In Greek, the indirect object is typically expressed with the dative, as it is in this case as well. To ergo is a dative singular of to ergon, as we have learned. It's important to note, however, that the dative is not only the case used for indirect object. The dative has other uses as well. A common use is the so-called instrumental dative use. That is a dative which expresses the means by which something is done. If we would read to ergo here as an instrumental dative, the full sentence he parthenos eche logon to ergo would translate into the maiden has a bird by means of her work. Indeed, this is a possible translation of this sentence as well. So in order to determine if a dative represents an indirect object or some other syntactical element, for instance, an instrumental dative, we thus require more context. For instance, a longer sentence or a larger narrative in which the sentence is embedded. In this context, it's worth noting as well that in Greek, the order of the words in a clause or in a sentence plays no part in determining the syntactic roles of words in the clauses. The order of the words can be arbitrarily changed, and yet the sentence will retain its meaning, as long as the words maintain their cases. This, of course, is contrary to the syntactical rules we are familiar with in English, where we get an entirely different meaning if we change the order of the words in the sentence. The maiden has a word for the work can be changed to, for example, the work has a word for the maiden. And we then get two quite opposite meanings. Although in both sentences, the forms of each individual word are the same. Now, a final more general syntactical reflection may end this lecture. As I said above, the nominative case is usually reserved for the subject of a sentence or a clause. This, however, is not always the case. In classical Greek, as in modern English, nouns in the nominative can also fulfill other syntactical functions. An example of such a function is that of the complement noun, which function is that of completing the meaning of another noun. This noun is in turn, or can be, the real subject of the sentence. As an example of a complement noun, we can take the very first sentence in our Greek textbook. Chronos didaskalos ton anthropon estin. Time is the teacher of humans. The second noun, didaskalos, teacher, like the first, chronos, time, is here in the nominative. However, it's time that is the subject, whereas the other noun, teacher, is merely introduced to complete the meaning of the first noun. That is, it is there to show what time really is. Now, one final reminder to close this lecture. When determining syntactical roles of words in sentences, you must always keep in mind congruence. This means, for instance, that if a subject is in the plural, the predicative connected to that subject must be in the plural as well. And vice versa. If a predicate is in the singular, for instance, in the third person singular, then the subject connected to that predicate must be in the singular as well. And the subject cannot then be in the first or second person either. It must be in the third person, like the predicate it connects to. Okay, that was quite a large amount of content, but necessary for this first lecture.